Keep hidden in the kitchen, your sister will charm the VIPs. My father barked those words over the roar of the industrial exhaust fan, aggressively ripping the grease-stained apron right off my neck. I am Maya, 33 years old, and tonight was supposed to be the triumphant grand opening of my culinary masterpiece. Instead, my white brother-in-law Brad sneered at my dreadlocks and told me the elite investors out there did not want to see a sweaty urban cook running the show. I did not cry. I calmly turned off the stove, dropped the apron, and told them to cook the truffle Cajun menu themselves. Then I walked straight through the double doors, right past the $7 million investor, and quit. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth and tried to hide your brilliance. The kitchen of our new restaurant, supposedly a family enterprise, was my sanctuary. I had spent the last 8 grueling months bleeding over these stainless steel prep tables. I designed a tasting menu that perfectly fused our grandmother's southern soul food roots with high-end French culinary techniques. The scent of roasted garlic brown butter and seared scallops hung heavy and warm in the air. The energy was electric. We were exactly 30 minutes away from serving the main course to Mr. Sterling, a legendary venture capitalist. He was sitting in our dining room with a $7 million check that could make or break this entire business. I was carefully plating a delicate amuse-bouche with my tweezers when the heavy swinging doors kicked open. My father, Marcus, stormed in. His face was tight with that familiar frantic energy he always radiated when he was desperately trying to impress wealthy white people. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit that cost more than my entire kitchen staff made in a week. Right behind him sauntered Brad, my sister, Chloe's husband. Brad was an arrogant finance bro who wore expensive loafers without socks and genuinely believed he understood the restaurant industry just because he watched a few cooking shows on television. My father did not ask how the food was coming along. He did not ask if my team needed help. He marched right up to my station, reached around my neck, and forcefully untied my apron. "What are you doing?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. "Keep hidden in the kitchen," my father ordered, his voice echoing off the sterile tile walls. "Your sister will charm the VIPs out there. We cannot have you walking into the dining room looking like this." He gestured vaguely at my arms, which were covered in artistic culinary tattoos, and then pointed at my natural dreadlocks, which were tied back in a neat professional bun. Brad stepped forward, a patronizing smirk playing on his thin lips. "Look, Maya," he said, adjusting his heavy gold watch. "Do not take this personally. This is a high-stakes game tonight. We are asking Mr. Sterling for $7 million. The elite investors out there expect a certain sophisticated image, a refined, upscale dining experience. They simply do not want to see some sweaty urban cook hovering over their expensive plates. It ruins the aesthetic. My sister Chloe is out there right now in a designer gown, pouring expensive champagne and making them laugh. Let her be the face of this place. You just be the hands in the back." My entire kitchen staff froze. The prep cooks, the dishwashers, and even the loyal sous chef I had trained for months completely stopped what they were doing. The only sound left in the massive room was the loud sizzling of the cast iron pan directly in front of me. For my entire life, I had been the family scapegoat. I was the rebellious child who refused to go to law school. I was the one who chose the brutal heat of the kitchen over the cold, sterile safety of corporate America. They had always treated me like an embarrassment, but I had built this entire menu from scratch. Every flavor profile out there was born from my imagination. Every single recipe was mine. I looked over at my father. He cowardly refused to meet my eyes, choosing instead to inspect a fake smudge on the metal counter. He was choosing the golden child and her wealthy, disrespectful husband over my blood, sweat, and tears, exactly like he always did. But this time, something inside me finally snapped. I realized in that exact moment that no matter how hard I worked, no matter how brilliant my food was, they would only ever see me as the help. I did not yell. I did not throw a tantrum. I simply reached forward and turned the gas dial until the bright blue flame extinguished. The sizzling slowly died down. I wiped my hands on a clean white sterile towel, balled it up, and tossed it directly onto Brad's shiny Italian leather shoes. "All right," I said, my voice cutting through the thick silence of the room. "Let us see you and your country club princess cook the truffle Cajun menu." Brad's smirk instantly vanished. "Wait, what are you doing?" he stammered, his face dropping as I grabbed my personal knife roll. My father finally looked up, his eyes widening in sudden panic. "Maya, stop being dramatic! Get back to the stove!" he commanded, his voice trembling slightly. I ignored them both. I pushed past my father, the heavy strap of my knife bag digging into my aching shoulder. I pushed open the double doors leading into the main dining room. The transition from the bright, loud kitchen to the dim, romantic lighting of the restaurant was jarring. I walked straight through the elegant room, leaving them all far behind me forever. The dining room was a sprawling sea of crushed velvet booths and imported crystal chandeliers. I kept my chin high, my heavy leather knife roll slung over my aching shoulder, and marched directly toward the front doors. To get there, I had to walk right past the center VIP table. The air out here smelled of expensive perfume and melted wax, a stark contrast to the grease and fire of my kitchen. I could see my sister Chloe standing by the massive circular booth in her shimmering emerald gown. She was leaning over the table with a practiced, radiant smile, pouring a rare vintage wine for our lead investor. Mr. Sterling was a formidable man, with silver hair and sharp, calculating eyes. He was legendary in the venture capital world for making or breaking culinary empires. Right at this moment, he was lifting his silver fork to taste the delicate scallop appetizer I had plated less than 5 minutes ago. As my heavy work boots clicked loudly against the polished hardwood floor, Mr. Sterling paused mid-motion. He looked up, his sharp eyes locking directly onto mine. He lowered his fork to the plate. "Maya," he said, his deep voice carrying clearly over the soft jazz music. "Maya, from the Midnight Supper Club." Chloe immediately panicked. I watched her perfect smile falter for a fraction of a second before she smoothly stepped into his line of sight, desperately trying to block his view of me. "Oh, Mr. Sterling, please do not mind her." Chloe laughed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "That is just our prep cook. She is heading home for the night, probably exhausted from chopping vegetables. Please try the scallop. My husband Brad conceptualized the dish himself." Mr. Sterling did not even look at Chloe. He completely ignored her desperate display. He looked down at the perfectly seared scallop sitting in the rich pool of brown butter, then back up at me. He took a small, measured bite. He closed his eyes for a second, clearly savoring the complex layers of spice, the subtle heat of the Cajun seasoning blending with the earthy truffle. Then he dropped his silver fork onto the fine porcelain plate with a loud, sharp clink. "A prep cook," he repeated, finally turning his cold gaze to my sister. "Do not insult my intelligence, Chloe. This signature flavor profile is exclusively Maya's. I attended 3 of her underground pop-up dinners last year, practically begging to invest in her talent. And it looks like she just walked out of your kitchen." I stopped a few feet from the front doors. I slowly turned around to face the table. At that exact moment, Brad and my father burst through the swinging kitchen doors. They froze in absolute horror as they witnessed the catastrophic scene unfolding before them. "Yes, Mr. Sterling," I said clearly, making sure my steady voice carried across the sudden silence of the dining room. "I am the executive chef. I designed this entire menu from scratch. Every recipe is mine, and I just quit because my family wanted to hide me in the back like a dirty secret." The color completely drained from Brad's face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. He rushed over to the VIP table, sweating heavily through his custom suit. "Mr. Sterling, please let me explain this misunderstanding," Brad stammered, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "We simply had a minor internal disagreement tonight. She is just being highly emotional and irrational. I assure you the kitchen is fully under control." Mr. Sterling stood up slowly, He towered over Brad, radiating pure authority and disgust. Emotional Sterling repeated testing the word on his tongue as if it tasted foul. His voice was incredibly cold and dangerous. You sat in my corporate office last week, Brad, and you explicitly guaranteed me that the visionary chef behind this concept retained 40% ownership of the operating company. You assured my legal team that my investment was directly backing the creative genius who authored this menu. You lied to my face about the entire ownership structure of this business. My father rushed forward, his face flushed with panic, begging Mr. Sterling to sit back down and please just let them serve the main course. But the wealthy investor completely ignored him. Mr. Sterling reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp white envelope. He slid a single piece of thick paper out of it. It was the $7 million cashier's check, the exact check my family had been desperately relying on to keep this sinking ship of a restaurant afloat. I do not fund liars, Mr. Sterling said, his voice echoing in the dead quiet room. And I certainly do not fund a restaurant that just lost its only valuable asset. He held the check up right in front of Brad's sweating, terrified face. Then, with one smooth and deliberate motion, Mr. Sterling ripped the $7 million check in half. He put the two pieces together and ripped them again, tearing their dreams into tiny, worthless shreds. He dropped the shredded pieces of paper directly into Chloe's half-full glass of expensive champagne. The transaction is officially canceled, Sterling announced. He grabbed his heavy wool coat from the back of the chair. He walked past my stunned, open-mouthed family, stopped right in front of me, and gave me a brief, respectful nod. You deserve better than this, Maya, he said quietly, before pushing open the glass doors and exiting into the night. The restaurant was completely paralyzed. Diners at the surrounding tables were openly staring at the spectacular collapse of my family's empire. Chloe stood frozen like a statue, staring down at the soggy pieces of paper floating in her wineglass, her mouth hanging open in pure shock. My father looked like he was about to collapse from a heart attack, gripping the edge of the table for support. I felt a massive weight lift off my chest. I gave them one last dismissive look, pushed open the heavy front doors, and stepped out into the cool, refreshing night air. I did not even make it to my parked car before I heard the restaurant doors violently smash open behind me. Maya Brad screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with unhinged rage. He was sprinting across the dark asphalt, his face purple with fury, chasing me straight into the empty parking lot. I reached my beaten-up sedan just as Brad caught up to me. He did not even bother to catch his breath before he violently slammed both of his heavy hands down onto the hood of my car. The loud metallic bang echoed across the empty asphalt of the parking lot. His custom-tailored suit was completely wrinkled, and his expensive silk tie was thrown over his shoulder from his frantic sprint out of the restaurant. He looked absolutely deranged. You are not going anywhere. He snarled, his chest heaving as he pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. You just destroyed months of my hard work. You ruined our family legacy in front of the most powerful man in the city. I am going to sue you into absolute oblivion, Maya. I am going to bury you in so much litigation for corporate sabotage that you will never be able to afford a frying pan again. I stood there under the flickering yellow light of a broken street lamp and looked at this pathetic man. I did not feel fear. I did not feel intimidated by his desperate display of false authority. Instead, a genuine laugh bubbled up from my chest. It started as a low chuckle and quickly grew into a loud laugh that I simply could not contain. I leaned against the cold metal of my car door and shook my head at him. You are going to sue me, Brad? I asked, keeping my voice light and genuinely amused. On what grounds exactly? Because last time I checked the law, you cannot sue a phantom for corporate sabotage. Brad sneered, clearly thinking he held all the winning cards in his perfectly manicured hands. He wiped the nervous sweat from his forehead and puffed out his chest, trying to regain his dominant, authoritative posture. Breach of contract, he declared loudly, as if he were a high-powered attorney delivering a closing argument on a television show. Breach of fiduciary duty. You abandoned your post as an executive partner during a critical financial transaction. My lawyers will take everything you own. We will seize your apartment, your bank accounts, and every single recipe you ever scribbled down in your little notebooks. You are legally bound to this business, and you just broke that bond. I crossed my arms and stared him dead in the eyes. Are you sure about that? I asked quietly. Because unless my memory is completely failing me, you took care of that little detail last month, did you not? For a brief second, the arrogant mask slipped from his face. His eyes darted away, staring nervously at the cracked pavement, before snapping back to me. He straightened his suit jacket, suddenly looking very proud of himself again. He actually smiled a nasty, condescending little grin that exposed his true manipulative nature. "Oh, you mean the business licenses?" he said smoothly, his voice dripping with superiority and racial privilege. "Yes, Maya. I did restructure the operating agreement. I had my legal team draft new documents and I convinced your father to sign off on them behind your back. We completely removed your name from the limited liability company. We completely erased your 40% equity stake." He took a step closer to me, lowering his voice to a mocking whisper. "Did you really think I would let someone with your volatile, unpredictable urban nature hold the keys to a multi-million-dollar enterprise? You are a massive liability, Maya. You are too emotional. You do not understand high-level finance or corporate structuring. I transferred your shares directly to myself and Chloe to protect the family assets from your inevitable sabotage. So yes, you are legally nothing to this company. You are just a glorified line cook who threw a tantrum in front of a guest. And I will still sue you for damages as a rogue employee who disrupted my business operations." I listened to his entire speech without interrupting him once. I let him bask in his own perceived brilliance. He genuinely thought he had outsmarted me. He thought his country club lawyers and his finance degree made him invincible. He had stolen my equity behind my back, convinced my easily manipulated father to betray me, and thought he had trapped me in a legal cage of his own design. But his supreme arrogance had completely blinded him to the actual reality of the law. "Brad," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion, "you just confessed to removing me from the operating agreement. You erased me from the corporate structure. You took away my equity to protect your precious assets. Do you even realize what that actually means in the real world outside of your country club?" He frowned, his confident smile faltering as he realized I was not begging for my job back. "What are you talking about?" he snapped, crossing his arms defensively across his chest. "It means I am not a partner," I explained slowly, as if I were speaking to a small, exceptionally slow child who could not grasp basic concepts. "It means I have no fiduciary duty to you or this restaurant. It means I never signed a non-compete clause because you stripped me of my executive title. It means I am simply an at-will employee who just quit because her boss created a hostile and discriminatory work environment." You cannot sue an at-will employee for quitting their job, Brad. There is no corporate sabotage because I do not own any part of your corporation. You made sure of that yourself when you stole my shares. Brad's mouth opened, but no words came out. He blinked rapidly as the legal reality of his own deceitful actions finally began to crash down on him. I could literally see the gears turning in his head as he calculated the massive disaster he had just orchestrated. I reached for the handle of my car door and pulled it open. I tossed my heavy leather knife roll onto the passenger seat and slid behind the steering wheel. I inserted the key into the ignition, and the engine roared to life, the bright headlights cutting through the darkness and illuminating Brad's pale, terrified face. I rolled down the window and rested my arm on the doorframe. I looked up at him one last time, taking in his ruined suit and his desperate posture. "You erased me from the liabilities, Brad," I said, my voice ringing clear and sharp in the cold night air. "You took out massive loans to pay for those crystal chandeliers and those velvet booths. But nobody eats velvet, Brad. They came for my food. Let us see how you handle the massive overhead without my talent to pay the bills. Have a wonderful grand opening." I shifted the car into drive and pressed my foot down on the gas pedal. I did not look back as I drove out of the parking lot, leaving him standing there in the cold, completely panicked and entirely alone with the monstrous failure he had built with his own two hands. I drove straight to my small apartment on the other side of town. My hands were still shaking slightly from the adrenaline of the confrontation, but my mind was completely clear for the first time in months. I walked through my front door, tossed my heavy keys onto the kitchen counter, and collapsed onto my worn fabric sofa. I just wanted to close my eyes and breathe. I wanted to enjoy the sweet silence of my newly claimed freedom. But that peace lasted exactly 45 minutes. I heard the distinct metallic scrape of a key sliding into my front door lock. I sat up straight just as the door violently swung open, hitting the wall with a loud thud. My mother Evelyn marched into my living room like a commanding general invading enemy territory. Right behind her was my father Marcus, looking completely exhausted and deeply angry. Trailing in last was Chloe, still wearing her shimmering emerald gown, though her perfect makeup was now artfully smudged to make it look like she had been crying for hours. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. "How did you get in here?" I demanded, though I already knew the answer. I had given my mother a spare key 2 years ago for extreme emergencies only. Apparently, me refusing to be their obedient little kitchen slave qualified as a national crisis. Evelyn did not even hesitate. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face and unleashed decades of toxic resentment. "How could you do this to us?" She screamed, her voice shrill and piercing in my small living room. "How could you intentionally humiliate your own flesh and blood in front of the most important people in this city? You have always been jealous of your sister Maya. Ever since you were little girls, you could never stand the fact that Chloe was the successful one. You could never accept that she married a brilliant man like Brad, while you were busy chopping onions in a greasy apron. You sabotaged this entire night just to ruin her moment." I stared at my mother, absolutely disgusted by her twisted version of reality. I was not jealous of Chloe. I pitied her. She was a grown woman who had never worked a hard day in her entire life, completely dependent on an arrogant man who had just bankrupted their future. "I am not jealous of anyone," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "I simply refuse to let Brad steal the credit for my recipes and hide me like a dirty secret. If Chloe is so successful, she can cook the food herself." My father stepped forward, his face flushed red with panicked rage. He held up his hands, aggressively cutting off my sentence. "Enough with the childish attitude, Maya," he barked. "This is not a game. This is real life and real money. You are going to wake up tomorrow morning, put on a respectful outfit, and march right down to Mr. Sterling's corporate office. You are going to get down on your knees and beg that man for his forgiveness. You will tell him you had a mental breakdown. You will tell him whatever he needs to hear to get him to tape that $7 million check back together." I crossed my arms and let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Are you completely out of your mind?" I asked him. "I am never stepping foot in that kitchen again, let alone begging a billionaire to fund Brad's fraudulent business." "You do not understand the situation," my father yelled, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. "We are drowning, Maya. Do you have any idea how much money Brad spent to make that dining room look like a five-star establishment? The imported velvet booths, the crystal chandeliers, the custom marketing campaigns. We are hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt just from the renovations. We needed Sterling's money to cover the massive loans Brad took out. If that restaurant does not open and generate massive profits immediately, we are completely finished." Chloe sniffled loudly, stepping out from behind my father and playing her favorite role of the fragile victim. "Brad worked so hard for us," she whined, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue. "He just wanted the restaurant to look perfect. He wanted us to be a prominent family. Why do you always have to ruin everything for me, Maya?" I took a step toward my sister, the anger finally boiling over the edge. "Ruin everything for you," I repeated, my voice rising in volume. "Why is it that my back-breaking labor is always required to fund your luxury lifestyle, Chloe? Why is my sweat and my talent supposed to pay for your designer gowns and Brad's fake country club aesthetic? You both wanted to play the roles of wealthy restaurant owners, but neither of you wanted to do the actual work. You let your husband steal my equity and erase my name from the company, and you expect me to stay in the hot kitchen and pay your debts. You are both parasites. Do not speak to your sister that way. Evelyn shrieked, stepping between us like a shield protecting her precious golden child. She grabbed my arm tightly, her long acrylic nails digging painfully into my skin. You selfish, ungrateful little girl. You are ruining our family legacy. You are destroying everything we have built. I yanked my arm away from her grip, rubbing the angry red marks she left behind. What legacy? I snapped back. This family does not have a legacy. We have a mountain of debt and a lying white son-in-law who convinced you to hand over the keys to the castle. Brad does not have a dime of his own money. How did he even secure those massive renovation loans in the first place without Sterling backing him up yet? The room suddenly fell dead silent. Chloe looked down at the floor, biting her lower lip nervously. My father closed his eyes and rubbed his temples, looking like he had aged 10 years in the last 5 minutes. Evelyn glared at me, her chest heaving, as she prepared to drop the ultimate betrayal. She wanted to hurt me. She wanted to make me feel the full crushing weight of what I had supposedly ruined. Because Brad had to take out a second mortgage on Big Mama's house to fund this. She screamed the words, tearing through the quiet apartment like a physical blow. You are ruining our family legacy. I froze completely. The air was sucked right out of my lungs. My entire body went completely numb. Big Mama's house, the beautiful property in the historic district that my grandmother had worked 3 jobs to pay off. The house she had explicitly left in a family trust so that no generation of our family would ever be homeless. It was our sanctuary. It was the only piece of true generational wealth our family had ever owned. I looked at my father, begging him silently to tell me my mother was lying just to hurt me. You let Brad mortgage Grandma's house? I whispered, my voice completely hollow. You let him put our family home on the line for velvet booths and crystal chandeliers? We had to leverage our assets to secure the capital, my father muttered, refusing to look me in the eye. Brad said it was a foolproof investment. Once Sterling gave us the $7 million, we were going to pay off the mortgage immediately. It was just a bridge loan, Maya. A bridge loan. They gave a manipulative, arrogant outsider the legal power to risk my grandmother's legacy. The room started to spin. The magnitude of their absolute stupidity and betrayal was too massive to comprehend all at once. Big Mama's house was mortgaged by Brad. And because I walked out because Sterling ripped up that check, the bank was going to take it. I realized in that horrifying moment that the trap Brad had built was not just for me. He had trapped my entire family, and they had willingly handed him the rope. I showed them the paperwork. I demanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Show me exactly how a legally binding family trust, set up by my grandmother, was somehow handed over to a man who married into this family less than 3 years ago. My father looked away, suddenly finding the cheap carpet of my apartment fascinating. But my sister Chloe did not flinch. She actually smiled, a sickeningly proud expression spreading across her perfectly made-up face. She reached into her expensive designer handbag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She tossed it onto my coffee table with a loud slap. I do not expect someone who chops vegetables for a living to understand high-level estate management, Chloe said, dripping with condescension. Brad noticed that Big Mama's trust was outdated and inefficient. It was generating absolutely no passive income. He explained to Mom and Dad that leaving $1 million property sitting untouched was a terrible financial strategy, so he graciously offered to restructure the entire estate. We transferred the deed into a new holding company that Brad exclusively manages, because unlike you, my husband actually knows how to handle money. I stared at the envelope on the table as if it were a venomous snake. I did not even need to open it to know they had signed their own death warrants. You transferred the deed of our grandmother's fully paid-off house to Brad. I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of absolute rage and profound disbelief. You gave away the only valuable thing this family owns so he could take out a massive commercial loan to buy crystal chandeliers. And you did not think to consult me, an equal beneficiary of that trust. You were always too emotional about that house, my mother Evelyn interjected sharply, stepping forward to defend her golden son-in-law. Brad has a Master of Business Administration degree. He understands leverage. He promised us that once the restaurant was wildly successful, he would pay off the new mortgage and we would all be incredibly wealthy. He was trying to elevate this family, Maya. And you ruined it out of pure spite. My father finally found his voice. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a different set of folded papers. "We can still fix this," he said, his tone shifting from angry to desperate. "I called Brad on the way over here. He is willing to forgive your little stunt tonight if you sign this new agreement." He spoke to his lawyers. They drafted a compromise. I slowly reached out and took the papers from my father's trembling hand. I unfolded the crisp white sheets and began to read the bold print. It was not a compromise. It was a modern-day slavery contract. Brad was graciously offering me the position of executive chef for the next 10 years. But there was no equity. There was no profit sharing. The salary listed was literally the state minimum wage. The contract also explicitly stated that any recipe technique or menu concept I created during that decade would become the sole intellectual property of Brad's holding company. "This is an exploitative joke," I said, looking up from the pages. "You are asking me to sign away my talent, my recipes, and my next 10 years for minimum wage just to save the restaurant that Brad legally stole from me. You want me to be an indentured servant so he can pay off the mortgage he secretly took out on our grandmother's house. It is the only way to save the family." "Maya," my father pleaded, stepping closer. "If we do not get that $7 million check from Mr. Sterling, the bank will foreclose on Big Mama's house in a matter of months. Brad said he can call Sterling tomorrow and tell him you had a change of heart. You just have to sign the contract and go back to the kitchen. Do it for your family. Do it for your grandmother. Do not you dare use her name to manipulate me," I shouted, the raw anger finally exploding out of my chest. "Big Mama would be absolutely disgusted by all of you. She worked her entire life to make sure we would never be at the mercy of arrogant men like Brad. And you willingly handed him the keys to her legacy because he wore a nice suit and used big financial words." "Sign the contract, Maya," Chloe demanded, her hands placed firmly on her hips. "Or we will completely disown you. You will be dead to this family." I looked at my sister, then at my father, and finally at my mother. I saw no love in their eyes. I saw only panic, greed, and a desperate desire to force me back into my designated place at the bottom of their hierarchy. They did not care about my dreams. They only cared about protecting the golden child and her fraudulent husband from the massive consequences of their own reckless actions. I gripped the thick stack of papers in both hands. I stared directly into my father's eyes as I ripped the legal documents completely in half. The sound of tearing paper was loud and satisfying in the tense room. I stacked the halves together and ripped them again, letting the shredded pieces fall like snow onto the floor, right onto my father's expensive shoes. "I am already dead to this family," I said coldly. "Now get out of my apartment before I call the police." My father looked utterly defeated, staring down at the shredded contract. Chloe let out a loud gasp of offended shock. But my mother Evelyn simply stood there, her face hardening into a mask of pure ice. She did not yell. She did not cry. She looked at me with a chilling lack of maternal affection. "Then you leave us no choice," Evelyn stated, her voice as sharp and cold as a razor blade. "You think you are so independent, Maya. You think you can just walk away from your obligations. But you forgot one very important detail." She pointed a long, manicured finger around my living room. "Since Brad owns Big Mama's house, and technically this entire apartment building was originally purchased and managed under that same estate, he is now your legal landlord." I froze, the blood running completely cold in my veins. Evelyn smiled, a cruel, triumphant smile. "Brad initiated the eviction protocols an hour ago. You have exactly 24 hours to pack your things and get out of this building. You are evicted." I did not beg them to stay. I did not shed a single tear in front of them. The moment the door clicked shut behind my mother, I grabbed the large duffel bags from the top of my closet and began frantically packing my life into canvas sacks. I took only the absolute essentials: my comfortable work clothes, my expensive personal kitchen tools, my laptop, and the few framed photographs of Big Mama that I absolutely refused to leave behind. I spent the last of my available cash on a dingy room at a cheap roadside motel on the dirty outskirts of the city. The walls were paper thin, the carpet smelled faintly of stale smoke and cheap bleach, and the bright neon vacancy sign outside my window buzzed incessantly through the dark night. I was completely cut off. My family had officially discarded me like garbage, tossing me out onto the street simply because I refused to be their silent, sacrificial lamb. For 2 entire days, I sat alone in that cramped motel room, eating cheap instant noodles and staring at the stained ceiling, waiting for my next move. I knew Brad would not just let me walk away quietly. His inflated ego was far too fragile for that. On the morning of the third day, a sharp, aggressive knock rattled my motel room door. I looked through the peephole to see a tall man in a crisp gray suit holding a thick stack of papers. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt and pulled the door open. "Are you Maya?" The man asked, his tone completely flat and highly professional. I nodded slowly. He immediately shoved a massive heavy leather binder directly into my chest. "You have been formally served," he announced coldly, before turning on his heel and walking quickly back to his parked luxury car. I carried the heavy binder over to the small, rickety wooden desk in the corner of the room and flipped open the thick black cover. The legal jargon was dense and extremely intimidating, printed on expensive watermarked paper. It was a formal cease and desist order, drafted by one of the most ruthless and expensive corporate law firms in the entire state. I scanned the highlighted sections, my eyes widening in pure disbelief at the sheer audacity of what I was actively reading. The document explicitly forbade me from cooking, selling, teaching, or even publicly discussing any of my own signature recipes. Brad and his highly paid lawyers had legally categorized every single flavor profile, sauce, and technique I had ever created as the exclusive trade secrets belonging to the family restaurant. According to the extensive paperwork lying on my cheap motel desk, if I dared to serve my Cajun truffle butter or my smoked paprika rub at any other establishment, I would be sued for millions of dollars in financial damages. They had essentially placed a legal embargo on my own brain. My cell phone buzzed violently against the wooden desk, jarring me out of my racing thoughts. The caller identification displayed Brad's name in bold letters. I took a deep breath, let it out slowly to steady my rapid heart rate, and pressed the green accept button. "Hello, Brad," I said, keeping my voice perfectly neutral and completely devoid of any fear. "Did you get my little care package this morning?" Brad sneered through the speaker. His voice echoed slightly like he was calling me on speakerphone from his spacious, newly renovated executive office. "I just wanted to make sure the courier found your charming new motel room. You see, Maya, you thought you could just walk away and take your massive talent with you to some direct competitor. You thought you could leave me high and dry with an empty restaurant and no executive chef. But you severely underestimated my extensive legal network." I flipped casually through the heavy, thick pages of the cease and desist order. "You cannot just trademark basic ingredients, Brad," I stated simply. "You cannot legally stop me from cooking food." "Oh, I am not stopping you from cooking." Brad laughed, a cruel and highly irritating sound that grated on my nerves. "I am just stopping you from cooking anything exceptionally good. Those specific recipes belong entirely to the corporation. You develop them while utilizing family resources, which means they are firmly classified as our proprietary intellectual property. I have already officially alerted every major restaurant group in the entire state. You are now completely radioactive, Maya. Nobody is ever going to hire a chef who brings an immediate intellectual property lawsuit the second she turns on a commercial stove. You cannot even flip a burger in this city without my direct written permission. You are done. You either come crawling back to my kitchen and sign the 10-year minimum wage contract, or you find a new career path outside the culinary world entirely. Enjoy the cheap motel, Maya." The line went dead with a sharp click. He hung up the phone, fully believing he had just delivered the final devastating blow to my spirit. He expected me to break down. He expected me to fall to my knees, cry into my cheap motel pillows, and realize that I was completely powerless against his massive financial resources and his team of ruthless corporate attorneys. But I did not shed a single tear. I tossed the phone onto the unmade bed and pushed the heavy legal binder to the side of the desk. I sat down on the hard plastic chair and flipped open my laptop. The screen glowed brightly in the dim motel room. I typed in my complex master password and bypassed the double authentication security walls I had set up months ago. My desktop background appeared completely empty except for one single highly encrypted folder sitting quietly in the bottom right corner of the screen. I hovered my mouse over the icon. The folder was labeled The Real Vault. Brad had no clue. I moved my hand away from the mouse and gently closed the laptop. The Real Vault could wait. Right now, timing was my most valuable weapon. I needed them to feel completely safe in their perceived victory before I dropped the floor out from under them. I stood up to stretch my aching back, but suddenly my cell phone began to vibrate violently against the cheap wooden desk. It was not a single phone call. It was a continuous frantic barrage of notifications. The screen lit up with dozens of text messages, Instagram tags, and TikTok mentions pouring in by the absolute second. I picked up the phone and opened my social media applications. My stomach tightened as I saw my own face plastered across the screen, overlaid with bold, dramatic text. Chloe had gone live. She had posted a highly edited, deeply manipulative video that was already racking up tens of thousands of views across our city. I tapped the screen to unmute the audio. There was my sister sitting on the plush velvet sofa of her pristine, custom-decorated living room. She had clearly styled herself specifically for this performance. She was wearing a modest, high-necked pastel blouse, her hair perfectly straightened, looking every bit the pious, respectable church-going wife. She was sobbing, but it was the kind of calculated crying that miraculously left her expensive makeup completely flawless. "My heart is absolutely broken today," Chloe whispered to the camera, dabbing the corner of her eye with a pristine white tissue. "Many of you know we were supposed to celebrate a massive milestone for our family business last night. Brad and I poured our life savings and our souls into building something beautiful for our community. But my estranged sister Maya showed up and intentionally destroyed it all." She took a deep, shaky breath, playing the role of the traumatized victim to absolute perfection. Chloe looked directly into the lens and lied with terrifying ease. She claimed I was deeply troubled and mentally unstable. She told her thousands of followers that I had demanded an extortionate amount of money right before the VIP dinner, and when they firmly refused to be blackmailed, I threw a violent tantrum. She actually looked into the camera and swore that I destroyed the kitchen and walked out with thousands of dollars worth of rare, expensive ingredients. She painted Brad as a heroic, forgiving husband who had just been trying to give his wayward, troubled sister-in-law a second chance at life. The comments section was an absolute bloodbath. Our city is a tight-knit place, and Chloe knew exactly which cultural nerves to strike to maximize the damage. She weaponized respectability politics with lethal precision. The local church congregation, the wealthy country club elite, and the older conservative generation of our African American community immediately rallied behind her. They saw Brad and Chloe as the shining pinnacle of Black excellence, the wealthy, married, respectable couple doing things the right way. And they saw me exactly how my family had always aggressively framed me. They viewed me as the rebellious, tattooed, dreadlocked failure who was aggressively dragging down the family name out of pure spite. The hate poured into my direct messages like a toxic, suffocating flood. Strangers called me a jealous thief. They accused me of having a crab in a barrel mentality, trying to pull my successful sister down because I was too lazy to build my own life. People I had cooked for people who had praised my food just weeks ago were now publicly disowning me in the comment sections. They told me I deserved to be homeless and destitute. A few messages even contained explicit death threats, promising severe physical violence if I ever dared to show my face near the family restaurant again. My phone grew incredibly hot in my hand from the sheer unyielding volume of incoming vitriol. My phone rang loudly, cutting through the endless stream of hateful notifications. It was Jamal, my loyal sous chef, who had walked out of the restaurant shortly after I did. I swiped the screen and answered the call. "Maya, you have to get online right now," Jamal shouted over the line, his voice thick with absolute panic. "Have you seen what Chloe is posting right now? They are completely destroying your reputation. You need to go live on Instagram immediately. Tell them the truth. Show them the text messages. Tell everyone that Brad stole your equity and forced you out. If you do not aggressively defend yourself, people are going to permanently believe this garbage." I leaned back in the hard plastic motel chair and stared out the dirty window at the flashing neon vacancy sign illuminating the dark street. "Jamal," I said calmly, deliberately, keeping my voice exceptionally low and steady. "I am not going to post a frantic rebuttal video. I am not going to argue with angry strangers in a comment section. I am not going to validate her pathetic performance by giving it the explosive reaction she desperately wants. But Maya, they are ruining your entire life," Jamal pleaded, clearly not understanding my utter lack of panic. "They are lying to the whole city and destroying your career before it even truly begins." I smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile to myself in the reflection of the dark motel window. "Let them lie, Jamal," I replied smoothly. "Never interrupt your enemy when they are making a public record of their own lies." I hung up the phone and placed it gently on the desk. I opened a new folder on my laptop and began meticulously taking high-resolution screenshots of every single defamatory video, every false caption, and every vicious comment Chloe interacted with. She thought she was winning the court of public opinion. She did not realize she was helping me build an ironclad legal dossier. While my digital vault was slowly filling with evidence, my actual bank account was rapidly emptying. Rent at the dingy motel was draining my meager savings, and the reality of my situation set in. I needed cash immediately. I ironed my only clean chef's coat, printed out a dozen copies of my resume, and hit the pavement. I targeted 3 of the most prestigious upscale restaurants in the city, places that were direct competitors to Brad's newly renovated dining room. My reputation as the genius behind the Midnight Supper Club secured me tasting interviews at all 3 establishments within 48 hours. My first interview was at a high-end French bistro downtown. I stepped into their massive kitchen and felt instantly at home. For my tasting test, I prepared a pan-seared duck breast with a cherry port wine reduction and a side of smoked Gouda polenta. The executive team tasted it, and their eyes lit up. The general manager shook my hand vigorously, told me I was exactly the visionary talent they needed, and promised to draft my employment contract by the end of the day. But the call never came. When I finally reached out the next morning, the manager sounded incredibly nervous. He stammered through a weak excuse about budget cuts and abruptly hung up the phone. I brushed it off as a strange coincidence and headed to my second interview at a modern fusion restaurant overlooking the river. Once again, I dominated the kitchen. I crafted a spicy lemongrass-infused sea bass that left the owners practically speechless. They offered me the executive chef position right there on the spot. I went back to my motel room feeling a massive wave of relief. But 3 hours later, I received a brief cold email stating they were moving in a different direction and wishing me the best of luck in my future endeavors. No phone call, no explanation, just a sudden inexplicable rejection. By the time I walked into my third interview, a creeping sense of dread had settled deep in my stomach. This restaurant was a legendary steakhouse owned by a veteran chef named Thomas, a man who had been a staple in the culinary scene for 30 years. I cooked a flawless bone and ribeye with a chimichurri sauce that I had perfected over the last 5 years. Thomas sat at a quiet corner table in the empty dining room and slowly ate the entire plate. When he finished, he put down his steak knife, wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, and let out a long, heavy sigh. He did not look happy. He looked deeply conflicted and genuinely sad. "Maya, the food is absolutely spectacular," Thomas said softly, gesturing to the empty plate. You are easily one of the most gifted chefs I have ever had the pleasure of hosting in my kitchen. You have a rare gift. Thank you, Thomas, I replied, sitting down across from him. So when can I start? Thomas shook his head slowly, rubbing his tired eyes. You cannot start, Maya. Not here. Not anywhere in this city. I cannot hire you. I leaned forward, my frustration finally bleeding through my calm facade. Why not? I demanded gently. You just said the food was spectacular. I am standing right in front of you, ready to work 80-hour weeks. What is going on, Thomas? Why is everyone suddenly pulling their offers at the very last second? Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of heavy watermarked paper. He slid it across the table toward me. I recognized the expensive stationery immediately. It was the exact same letterhead from the law firm that had served me the cease and desist order at the motel. Your brother-in-law Brad has been very busy, Thomas explained, his voice laced with quiet disgust. He has been personally calling every single major restaurateur, hotel manager, and culinary investor in the state. He is aggressively leveraging his country club connections and his finance network. Brad is telling everyone that you are currently under a massive federal investigation for corporate sabotage and intellectual property theft. I stared at the letter, my blood boiling. He is lying, Thomas, I said firmly. He stole my equity and forced me out. I believe you, Maya, Thomas replied kindly. But the truth does not matter when the legal threats are this expensive. Brad is officially threatening to sue any establishment that hires you. He claims that any dish you cook will be considered a direct infringement on his proprietary trade secrets. He promised to tie my restaurant up in years of frivolous bankrupting litigation if I let you anywhere near my stoves. I run a tight margin here, Maya. I cannot afford to fight a multi-million-dollar legal battle against his corporate lawyers just to hire a new executive chef. No one in this city can. He has completely blackballed you from the industry. I sat there in stunned silence. Brad had not just fired me. He was actively trying to starve me out. He was using his unearned wealth and his racial privilege to completely erase my ability to make a living, hoping I would become so desperate and destitute that I would have no choice but to crawl back to him and sign that slave contract. I thanked Thomas for his honesty, packed up my knives, and walked out the back door of the steakhouse. The sky had turned a bruised, angry gray, and a cold, heavy rain had begun to fall over the city. I did not have an umbrella. I pulled the hood of my jacket over my head and walked down the wet pavement. I pulled out my phone and checked my banking application. My available balance was exactly $50.12. That was not even enough to cover one more night at the cheap motel. I stopped walking and stood in the freezing rain, the cold water soaking through my clothes and chilling me to the absolute bone. The sheer weight of the betrayal and the massive scale of Brad's sabotage threatened to finally crush me. I was completely alone, professionally exiled, and entirely broke. Suddenly, the phone in my cold, wet hand began to vibrate violently. I looked down at the glowing screen through the raindrops. It was an unknown private number. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, wondering if it was just another one of Brad's lawyers calling to deliver more bad news. But something deep inside my gut told me to answer. I swiped the screen and lifted the phone to my ear. I swiped the screen and lifted the phone to my ear. Hello, I said, my voice shivering slightly from the freezing rain soaking through my thin chef jacket. Maya, a deep, resonant voice, replied immediately, bypassing any polite introductions or small talk. This is Richard Sterling. You are currently standing outside of Thomas' restaurant in a massive downpour. There is a small diner exactly 2 blocks south of your current location. Walk there, order a hot coffee, and sit in the back booth. We have an incredibly urgent matter to discuss. Before I could even process how he knew my exact location or formulate a single question, the line went completely dead. He had hung up. I lowered the phone, staring at the blank screen as the rain continued to relentlessly batter my face. I did not have time to hesitate. I tucked the phone securely into my pocket, pulled my thin hood tighter around my freezing face. and began speed walking south down the flooded sidewalk. 10 minutes later, I pushed open the heavy glass door of the old diner. The warm air hit my frozen face like a physical wall, smelling strongly of burnt coffee and cheap frying oil. I found the back booth, slid onto the cracked red vinyl seat, and used paper napkins to desperately dry my soaking dreadlocks. The waitress brought over a steaming mug of black coffee, without me even asking, quietly mentioning that the wealthy gentleman on the phone had already paid for it. I wrapped my freezing hands around the thick ceramic mug, letting the intense heat thaw my numb fingers. My phone rang again. It was the same private number. I answered on the first ring. "Are you warm now?" Sterling asked, his tone strictly business and completely devoid of pity. "I am listening," I replied, refusing to sound weak or intimidated despite my current miserable financial circumstances. "Good," Sterling said smoothly over the secure line. "I am calling you because I have been closely monitoring your situation since I walked out of that disastrous dining room. I am fully aware of the vicious smear campaign your sister Chloe is currently running across every social media platform in this city. I am also acutely aware that Brad has spent the last 48 hours aggressively calling every major culinary establishment in the state, utilizing his country club connections, to effectively blackball you from the industry. I know he sent cease and desist letters to everyone, including Thomas." "How do you know all of this?" I asked, taking a slow sip of the scalding black coffee. "Because I am a man who heavily protects his potential investments," Sterling answered without a single ounce of hesitation. "And because Brad is incredibly predictable. When I tore up that $7 million check, I did not just walk away and forget about the brilliant Midnight Supper Club chef. I immediately hired a specialized team of forensic accountants to run a massive, deep background check on your brother-in-law. I wanted to know exactly who had the sheer audacity to lie to my face about the ownership structure of a hospitality company I was about to fund." I leaned forward over the scratched formica table, my heart suddenly beating much faster against my ribs. "What did your accountants find out about him?" Sterling let out a dark, humorless chuckle. "Massive financial irregularities, Maya. The man is completely incompetent. He is drowning in extreme high-interest debt. He fraudulently used inflated, entirely fictional financial projections to secure a second commercial mortgage on a residential property owned by your family trust. He is running a chaotic financial house of cards that is exactly one missed payment away from complete and total federal collapse. He needed my $7 million desperately, just to cover his illegal tracks, before the bank auditors noticed the massive glaring discrepancies." I closed my eyes, a heavy wave of sickening validation washing over me. I knew Brad was a manipulative liar, but hearing a billionaire confirm that he was actively committing mortgage fraud with Big Mama's house made the reality terrifyingly sharp. "Maya, listen to me very carefully," Sterling commanded, his voice dropping an octave and demanding my absolute, undivided attention. "I do not invest in restaurants, Maya. I invest in talent. I invest in visionaries who have the relentless drive to build absolute empires. Your family thought they were hiding the help in that hot kitchen, but they were actually hiding the golden goose. You are the sole reason that establishment had any value whatsoever." I stared down at the dark reflection of my own face in the black coffee. "Then what do you want from me, Mr. Sterling? I want to give you the $7 million directly." Sterling stated clearly, dropping the ultimate bombshell with zero dramatic hesitation. "I want to fully fund a new hospitality group where you are the sole majority owner and executive chef. No toxic family members, no fraudulent brothers-in-law, just you and your spectacular culinary genius." My breath caught sharply in my throat. $7 million. It was enough money to build a massive culinary empire, completely secure my future, and easily buy back Big Mama's house from whatever regional bank Brad had recklessly sold it to. "But there is always a catch," I said, knowing men like Sterling never handed out millions without a brutal condition attached. "You are highly intelligent," Sterling noted with a hint of genuine respect. "Yes, there is a major condition. I absolutely refuse to invest a single dime of my capital into a chef who is currently tied down by a heavy legal embargo. I do not care if Brad's cease and desist order is ultimately frivolous. I will not have my legal team fighting in local courts over the basic rights to a Cajun truffle butter recipe. You must legally destroy Brad's hold over your culinary rights yourself. You have to permanently obliterate his claim to your intellectual property so that he can never legally threaten our new enterprise. I can do that, I said, my voice rock solid with newfound determination. I already have a silent plan to force his hand and publicly expose the theft. You had better execute that plan flawlessly, Sterling warned. Because my private jet leaves for Tokyo in exactly 72 hours. I will be completely out of the country and entirely unreachable for an entire month. If you do not provide me with ironclad legal proof that you own your own recipes and that Brad has zero legal standing to sue us before I board that plane, the $7 million offer vanishes forever. You have exactly 72 hours, Maya. The clock starts right now. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone and placed it flat on the diner table. The freezing rain continued to beat heavily against the glass window outside, but I no longer felt the cold. The heavy despair that had been suffocating me just 10 minutes ago was completely gone, replaced by a roaring, furious fire. I had a billionaire backer, a strict deadline, and a hidden folder on my laptop that was about to detonate Brad's entire fake existence. I finished my black coffee in one large gulp, stood up from the booth, and walked back out into the violent storm. I walked back to my cheap motel room with a completely new posture. Brad thought he had successfully erased my name from the limited liability company. He thought he had trapped me with his expensive lawyers and his aggressive blackballing campaign. But he was about to learn a very painful lesson about intellectual property and federal law. I got back to the motel, locked the heavy deadbolt behind me, and immediately opened my laptop. I did not need to search for a new job anymore. I needed to prepare for war. The 72-hour countdown had officially begun, and I was not going to waste a single second. The next morning, I traded my damp chef jacket for the only sharp business suit I owned. I took an early bus downtown, walking into a massive glass skyscraper that housed Mr. Sterling's corporate headquarters. The contrast between my cheap, dingy motel room and this billion-dollar high-rise was staggering. A silent elevator shot me up to the 50th floor, where a receptionist immediately escorted me into a sprawling glass conference room overlooking the entire city. Mr. Sterling was already sitting at the head of a massive mahogany table, flanked by 3 men in exceptionally expensive tailored suits. These were not local attorneys. These were elite corporate sharks. Mr. Sterling stood up and offered me a firm, respectful handshake. "Maya, thank you for being prompt," he said, gesturing to an empty leather chair directly across from him. "These gentlemen are my personal legal counsel. We have exactly 48 hours left to finalize this arrangement." One of the lawyers slid a thick stack of freshly printed documents across the polished wood table. I looked down at the bold heading. It read, "Maya's Table Limited Liability Company." I skimmed the first few pages and my breath caught in my throat. Sterling was not playing games. The operating agreement explicitly stated that I would retain a full 80% ownership of the new hospitality group. He was taking only 20% for his $7 million capital injection. It was an incredibly rare and incredibly generous valuation in the venture capital world. "I invest in the artist," Maya, Sterling said, noticing my visible shock. "I do not want to control your kitchen. I simply want to profit from your genius. But as we discussed on the phone yesterday, this generous contract is completely contingent on you permanently neutralizing your brother-in-law." I reached into my leather bag and pulled out the heavy cease and desist binder that the courier had served me at the motel. I slid it across the mahogany table toward the lead attorney. "Brad thinks he has already neutralized me," I explained. "He legally categorized every single recipe, technique, and flavor profile I created as proprietary trade secrets belonging exclusively to his holding company." The lead attorney, a sharp-looking man with graying hair named Davis, opened the binder. He read the first 2 pages in complete silence. Then, completely unexpectedly, a loud, genuine laugh erupted from his chest. He tossed the binder back onto the table with a look of pure professional disdain. This document is an absolute joke. Davis chuckled, shaking his head. Your brother-in-law clearly hired a bottom-tier regional law firm to draft an intimidation tactic. It is full of massive legal holes. You cannot simply claim an entire flavor profile as a trade secret just by typing it into a threatening letter. To legally enforce a trade secret claim in a federal court, Brad has to actively prove two things. First, he has to prove that his company actually originated the intellectual property. Second, he has to actively use those exact recipes in public commerce to generate revenue. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. And what happens if I have indisputable federal proof that I originated the intellectual property years before he ever married my sister? I asked smoothly. Davis raised an eyebrow, his eyes flashing with predatory legal excitement. If you possess prior federal documentation proving sole ownership, and Brad actively attempts to sell those specific recipes to the public, while simultaneously claiming he invented them to secure investor capital, that is no longer just a civil dispute, Maya. That elevates his actions to criminal commercial fraud. Mr. Sterling tapped his gold pen against the table. But we need hard, undeniable proof that Brad is actively using your exact recipes in commerce right now, Sterling interjected. A threatening letter is not enough. We need to catch him in the absolute act of selling your intellectual property to wealthy investors while claiming it is his own. We need him to publicly incriminate himself. I sat back in the plush leather chair and stared out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. My mind raced through the layout of my family restaurant, the timeline of Brad's massive debt, and the desperate panic I had seen in my father's eyes. Brad was drowning. He had mortgaged Big Mama's house, and he desperately needed $7 million to save himself from total financial ruin. With Sterling out of the picture, Brad only had one viable option left. He had to find a new rich backer immediately. Suddenly, my cell phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. One of my old prep cooks, who was still trapped working in that miserable kitchen, had just sent me a frantic text message. It was a screenshot of a digital invitation that Chloe was aggressively blasting out to every wealthy country club member and venture capitalist in the entire state. I read the text on the invitation, and a slow, cold smile spread across my face. "What is it?" Maya Sterling asked, his eyes narrowing. "Brad and Chloe are hosting a massive venture capital tasting night tomorrow evening," I announced, sliding my phone across the table so the lawyers could see the digital invitation. "They are trying to secure a new primary investor to pay off the mortgage on my grandmother's house. The invitation explicitly promises an exclusive tasting of their proprietary Cajun truffle fusion menu." Davis let out a low whistle. "They are actually going to cook your exact recipes for a room full of millionaires and claim ownership of them. They are going to try," I corrected him softly. "But Brad does not actually know how to cook. He has my handwritten recipe notebooks, but he does not understand the chemistry behind the ingredients. He thinks he can just follow my instructions like a basic manual and duplicate my genius." I stood up from the mahogany table, my blood burning with absolute adrenaline. The legal trap was perfectly set. Brad was about to willingly walk right into a massive public fraud, and he was doing it in front of the most powerful people in the city. "Mr. Sterling," I said, looking the billionaire dead in the eyes, "have your legal team draft the final documents for Maya's table. You will have your undeniable proof of fraud by tomorrow night. I know exactly how to make them completely expose themselves." I opened a specific encrypted folder on my laptop and stared at the digital copies of my true, unedited life's work. Seeing the original formulas laid out perfectly on the bright screen transported my mind directly back to the night my family aggressively evicted me from my own apartment. While I was frantically packing my canvas duffel bags with my personal kitchen tools and clothes, my mother and sister were standing in the hallway outside my bedroom, practically drooling over the prospect of taking over my personal space. They thought they had rushed me out before I could secure my valuable assets. They thought they had caught me completely off guard. They were completely wrong. Before I zipped up my final bag and walked out the door, I had stopped by my polished granite kitchen island. I reached into the bottom of my heavy backpack and pulled out a beautiful, thick, leather-bound notebook. Across the dark brown cover, the words Master Recipes were elegantly embossed in shining gold lettering. I placed it directly in the center of the counter, completely visible and entirely impossible to miss. I did not forget it in my rush to leave. I planted it there on purpose like a hidden landmine, waiting for a greedy foot to step on it. I had known for several months that Brad was a greedy, untrustworthy opportunist. I had caught him snooping around my private prep station after hours, multiple times, asking far too many suspicious questions about my proprietary spice blends, my specialized cooking techniques, and my private sourcing contacts. So, to actively protect myself from his inevitable betrayal, I created a highly convincing decoy. I spent 3 entire weeks writing out that leather-bound notebook by hand during my rare days off. It contained the name of every single signature dish that had made my underground pop-up dinners famous, including the complex Cajun truffle tasting menu they were relying on to secure their $7 million investment. But the contents were entirely fabricated. I did not write down random garbage that would make them immediately suspicious upon reading it. I made incredibly subtle, catastrophic alterations to the core chemistry of the food. I deliberately swapped baking soda for baking powder in the bread recipes, ensuring the dough would never properly rise. I changed the vital resting times for the handmade pasta so the gluten structure would completely break down into mush. I adjusted the delicate ratios of salt, sugar, and acid, just enough to turn a rich, complex reduction sauce into an aggressively bitter nightmare. I wrote down explicit instructions to bloom delicate, expensive spices in cold oil instead of hot, guaranteeing the flavor profiles would turn violently rancid the moment they were introduced to high heat. To an arrogant finance bro like Brad, or a pampered housewife like Chloe, the heavy notebook looked like a priceless, closely guarded culinary treasure. To an actual trained chef, it was a ticking chemical time bomb. Right at this exact moment, miles away from my cheap motel room, that very time bomb was sitting wide open on the stainless steel prep table of our family restaurant. The kitchen was an absolute war zone of blind panic and severe disorganization. Because he had aggressively blackballed me, Brad could not hire a reputable executive chef to replace me. He had fired my loyal sous chef and hastily hired a crew of cheap, inexperienced line cooks who had absolutely no idea how to handle high-end temperamental ingredients. Brad was standing dead center in the blazing hot kitchen, his face slick with terrified, nervous sweat. He was aggressively clutching my leather-bound notebook to his chest, like a holy artifact, treating it as his only lifeline. The sprawling dining room just beyond the swinging doors was rapidly filling up with wealthy venture capitalists, local politicians, and snobby country club investors he desperately needed to impress to save Big Mama's house from the bank. Chloe burst through the swinging double doors, her emerald designer gown rustling loudly against the sterile tile floor. Her face was pulled tight with mounting anxiety, her fake smile completely gone. "Brad, the lead investors are asking for the first course," she hissed, her voice trembling with barely suppressed panic. "The mayor is sitting at table 4. Is the food ready to go out yet?" Brad slammed the heavy leather notebook down onto the metal counter with a loud bang. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger at a terrified young line cook who was frantically stirring a massive stainless steel pot of seafood bisque. "Follow the exact measurements in the book," Brad screamed, his voice cracking with sheer desperation and misplaced authority. "Do not change a single thing." Maya wrote this down herself. She is a psychotic, emotional liability, but her measurements are flawless. Just read the damn book and do exactly what it says on the page. The young cook nodded rapidly, wiping stinging sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm, and dumped an entire cup of modified Cajun seasoning directly into the simmering dairy base. He was following the handwritten instructions to the absolute letter, just as his boss commanded. Brad let out a heavy, ragged sigh of relief, adjusting his expensive silk tie and giving his terrified wife a confident, arrogant smile. He genuinely believed he had stolen my genius, and completely outsmarted the system. He thought the heavy leather book was his guaranteed golden ticket out of the massive financial grave he had recklessly dug for himself. What Brad and Chloe did not know, and what they were about to discover in the most public and humiliating way possible, was that the flawless instructions they were screaming at their underpaid cooks to follow were specifically designed to completely curdle the second they were plated. The trap was perfectly set, the fuse was lit, and the bomb was about to detonate right in their faces. I sat in my beat-up sedan, parked in the dark alley directly across the street from the family restaurant. The heavy rain had cleared, leaving a crisp, cold night that provided perfect visibility through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the dining room. From my vantage point in the shadows, I had a front-row seat to the absolute spectacle unfolding inside. The restaurant looked exactly like the five-star high society establishment Brad had drained Big Mama's house to build. The imported crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the plush, crushed velvet booths. The tables were draped in heavy white linen and set with gleaming silver cutlery. It was a picture-perfect facade, hiding a massive rotting core of fraud and theft. I reached over to the passenger seat and tapped the glowing screen of my cell phone. Davis, the lead corporate attorney from Mr. Sterling's legal team, was on speakerphone. His entire legal department was currently recording the audio of our phone call, documenting every single observation I made, as an official sworn statement. "Are you in position, Maya Davis?" asked his sharp voice, cutting through the quiet hum of my car engine. "I am exactly across the street," I replied, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the brightly lit dining room. "The guests have all arrived. It is a full house. I see the local district attorney, 3 major venture capitalists, and the president of the Regional Banking Association. My parents are working the room right now." Through the glass, I watched my mother Evelyn glide gracefully from table to table. She was wearing a stunning floor-length silver gown, a sparkling diamond necklace resting heavily on her collarbone. She was smiling that practiced, artificial smile she always reserved for wealthy strangers, gently touching the arms of the politicians and laughing loudly at jokes I could not hear. My father Marcus was standing near the expensive mahogany bar, holding a snifter of dark amber liquor. He was shaking hands with a prominent real estate developer, his chest puffed out with unearned pride. They were acting like royalty holding court in their newly claimed kingdom, completely oblivious to the fact that the floor beneath their feet was made of extremely thin, cracking ice. "Tell me when Brad makes his official presentation," Davis instructed over the phone. "We need verbal confirmation that he is actively taking credit for the intellectual property in front of potential financial investors." That is the exact moment the civil dispute legally escalates to criminal commercial fraud. I did not have to wait long. A few minutes later, the soft background jazz music was suddenly cut off. Brad walked confidently out of the swinging kitchen doors and strode directly to the center of the dining room. He wore an immaculate black tuxedo. He tapped a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute to command the attention of the incredibly wealthy room. Chloe immediately hurried to his side, linking her arm through his and beaming with absolute adoration. "He is stepping up to speak," I told Davis, leaning closer to my cold steering wheel. I watched Brad's mouth move as he delivered his welcoming speech. Even though I could not hear the exact words through the thick glass, I knew exactly what he was saying. I had seen him practice this exact pitch in the mirror dozens of times. He was gesturing expansively to the luxurious room, and then he pointed directly to his own chest. He raised his hands, imitating the passionate motions of a dedicated culinary artist. "He is taking the credit," I narrated for the lawyers recording the call. "He is telling them about the inspiration behind the menu. He is claiming the Cajun truffle fusion concept is his own proprietary creation. He is actively pitching the intellectual property to secure their investment capital." "Excellent," Davis replied smoothly. "The trap has officially snapped shut, Maya. We have the digital invitation he sent out claiming ownership, and now we have his public performance attempting to monetize those stolen assets. The legal requirement for commercial fraud is fully met. Now we just need to wait for the physical evidence to hit their tongues." Inside the brightly lit dining room, Brad finished his arrogant speech and raised his champagne flute in a grand toast. The entire room raised their glasses in response, politely applauding the handsome, confident man who promised them a revolutionary dining experience. Brad smiled warmly, bowed his head slightly in fake humility, and dramatically waved his hand toward the kitchen double doors. The newly hired waitstaff immediately poured out of the kitchen in a perfectly choreographed line. They were carrying massive silver trays loaded down with deep, wide-rimmed porcelain bowls. "The first course is coming out right now," I said into the phone, my heart beginning to hammer aggressively against my ribs. It is the signature truffle bisque. This was the dish that had secured me my initial underground following. In its true form, it was a perfectly balanced velvety masterpiece of rich cream, earthy wild mushrooms, and a very precise hit of sharp Cajun heat that lingered beautifully on the palate. But the recipe currently sitting in the bowls being placed in front of the wealthy investors was not my true formula. The line cooks had meticulously followed the decoy notebook. They had aggressively boiled the dairy base instead of gently simmering it. They had added the highly acidic lemon juice and the raw, harsh spice blend at the completely wrong stage of the chemical cooking process. I watched closely as a waiter placed a steaming bowl directly in front of the regional bank president. The man leaned forward casually inhaling the aroma before picking up his heavy silver soup spoon. All across the luxurious dining room, the local politicians and the venture capitalists were doing the exact same thing. Brad stood near the center table with his hands clasped behind his back, a triumphant, sickeningly confident smile plastered across his face as he waited for the inevitable wave of vocal praise. "They are picking up their spoons," I whispered to Davis. "They are taking the first bite right now." Through the glass, I saw the bank president put the silver spoon into his mouth. I saw the prominent real estate developer swallow a large mouthful of the hot liquid. I saw the district attorney taste the expensive soup. And then a very profound, horrifying silence fell over the entire luxury dining room as the catastrophic reality of the ruined dish finally registered with everyone inside. The silence only lasted for 3 agonizing seconds before the physical rejections began. The regional bank president immediately grabbed his crisp white linen napkin and violently spit the mouthful of bisque directly into it. He choked slightly, his face turning a deep shade of crimson as he reached frantically for his crystal water glass. Across the room, the prominent real estate developer pushed his heavy porcelain bowl away with such aggressive force that the thick, sludgy liquid sloshed over the sides and stained the pristine white tablecloth. The soup was not just bad, it was a spectacular chemical disaster. Because the young line cooks had aggressively boiled the dairy base and added the harsh acidic components at the entirely wrong moment, the rich cream had completely separated. It was now a bowl of greasy yellow liquid floating with large, unappetizing chunks of curdled milk. The carefully altered spice ratios I had written in the decoy notebook had transformed the delicate Cajun warmth into an intensely bitter, overwhelming metallic burn that coated the tongue and refused to wash away. I sat in my dark car pressing the phone closer to my ear. "They are rejecting the food, Davis," I reported, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "The investors are physically spitting it out into their napkins. The dairy has completely curdled and the spice profile is ruined." "Keep observing, Maya," Davis replied, his voice buzzing with legal anticipation. "Tell me what Brad does next." Inside the dining room, the polite high society atmosphere completely shattered. A woman sitting at the center table abruptly stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floor. She was a notorious local food critic known for her ruthless reviews, and she looked absolutely furious. "Is this supposed to be some kind of avant-garde joke?" she demanded loudly, her voice carrying easily across the sudden chaotic murmurs of the room. She pointed an accusing finger at her ruined bowl. "This tastes like rancid battery acid and spoiled milk. You promised us a revolutionary culinary experience. Brad and you are serving us literal garbage." The entire room erupted into angry murmurs and aggressive complaints. The politicians looked deeply offended. The venture capitalists who had been ready to write massive checks just 10 minutes ago were now wiping their tongues with napkins and demanding their expensive coats from the coat check girl. My mother, Evelyn, froze completely, her fake practice smile sliding right off her face as she watched the wealthy elite actively reject her family. My father, Marcus, looked like he was going to pass out right there next to the mahogany bar. Brad was vibrating with pure panic. His face drained of all color, leaving him looking sickly and terrified. He muttered a frantic, desperate apology to the angry food critic, and then sprinted across the dining room. He pushed his way through the swinging double doors and burst into the kitchen. Even from across the street, I could clearly see the violent explosion of rage happening through the small rectangular glass windows of the kitchen doors. Brad was screaming at the top of his lungs, his face contorted in blind fury. He grabbed a stainless steel ladle and threw it across the room. He marched right up to the terrified young line cook and pointed aggressively at the large simmering pot. "He is blaming the kitchen staff," I told Davis, watching the chaos unfold. "He thinks they messed up the recipe." But the young line cook did not back down. I watched as the kid reached onto the metal prep table and grabbed my heavy leather-bound notebook. He shoved the open pages directly into Brad's screaming face. The cook was pointing frantically at the handwritten measurements, aggressively defending himself. He was screaming right back at Brad, telling him that they had followed every single word written in the master recipe book to the absolute letter. They did exactly what Brad had commanded them to do. Brad snatched the leather book from the cook's hands and stared down at the open pages. I could actually see the exact moment his brain short-circuited. He read the measurements, he read the instructions, and he finally realized that the book was completely flawed. He realized he had built his entire multi-million-dollar scam on a foundation of poisoned sand. Out in the dining room, Chloe was rapidly losing her grip on reality. The perfect image she had spent years carefully cultivating was completely crumbling in front of her country club peers. She tried to approach the table of venture capitalists to offer a sweet apology, but the bank president simply held up his hand, stopping her dead in her tracks. He told her he was pulling his financial support immediately. Chloe covered her mouth with trembling hands. Her pristine emerald gown suddenly looked ridiculous in the middle of the absolute disaster. She completely broke down, bursting into loud, uncontrollable tears right in the middle of the luxury dining room. "We have everything we need," Maya Davis said through the phone speaker. "The fraud is confirmed, the intellectual property is completely protected, and his financial backing is officially destroyed. You are cleared to make your entrance." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. I reached into the back seat and grabbed the heavy wool overcoat I had purchased earlier that afternoon. Thanks to the generous financial advance Mr. Sterling had wired to my new corporate account, I was no longer wearing damp chef jackets or cheap discount store clothes. I slipped my arms into a razor-sharp, tailored designer suit that cost more than my old monthly rent. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, adjusting the collar. My dreadlocks were styled perfectly. My posture was absolutely rigid and my eyes were cold. I opened my car door and stepped out into the crisp night air. I did not rush. I walked slowly across the wet asphalt, my expensive leather heels clicking rhythmically against the street. I approached the heavy glass front doors of the restaurant and firmly pushed them open. I stepped into the warm, chaotic dining room and stood dead center in the entryway. I did not say a single word. I simply stood there, radiating total, absolute power. One by one, the angry guests noticed me standing there. The murmurs began to die down. The furious food critics stopped yelling. The bank president turned his head. Chloe choked on a loud sob and stared at me in pure horror. The swinging kitchen doors opened, and Brad walked out holding the useless leather notebook. He stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes locking onto mine. Within 10 seconds, the entire luxury dining room went completely dead silent. The whole room simply froze, waiting for my next move. I looked at the terrified faces of my family and the furious expressions of the wealthy investors. "You are currently eating stolen intellectual property," I announced, my voice ringing clearly across the silent dining room. "Brad stole my business, sent me a ridiculous cease and desist order, and tried to illegally recreate my menu using a decoy notebook I left behind as a trap. I highly recommend you all visit an emergency room tonight. I turned on my expensive leather heels and walked right back out into the cold night, leaving them trapped in the massive radioactive fallout of their own reckless greed. I went back to my motel room and slept perfectly for the very first time in months. The next morning, the atmosphere inside the family restaurant was absolutely apocalyptic. I was not there to witness it physically, but Jamal, my former loyal sous chef, had stayed behind to collect his final paycheck, and he texted me a minute-by-minute update of the spectacular collapse. Brad was locked inside the main office, frantically pacing the floor and screaming into his cell phone. He was desperately trying to do damage control before the news hit the local papers. He called the regional bank president, begging for a second chance and pleading for an extension on the mortgage. He called the venture capitalists, offering them absurd amounts of equity if they would just ignore the public disaster of the previous night. Every single person hung up on him immediately. Chloe was sitting at the mahogany bar, still wearing her ruined emerald gown from the night before, sobbing hysterically into her hands as her perfect socialite reputation burned to the ground. My parents were nowhere to be seen, having cowardly abandoned the sinking ship the moment the food critic walked out. Brad was sweating profusely, his expensive tuxedo shirt wrinkled and stained with spilled wine. He thought his biggest problem was finding a new primary investor to save Big Mama's house. He was completely wrong. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, a massive fleet of white official vehicles abruptly pulled into the restaurant parking lot, blocking the exits. The heavy front doors were violently pushed open, and a swarm of serious government officials marched directly into the dining room. There were 6 agents from the state health department wearing official blue windbreakers, carrying heavy metal clipboards and digital testing equipment. Right behind them walked 2 stern-looking auditors from the municipal licensing board, holding thick leather briefcases. Brad dropped his cell phone and sprinted out of the office, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He tried to physically block the lead health inspector, putting his hands up in a desperate, placating gesture. He aggressively demanded to know why they were barging into his private establishment without a scheduled appointment or a proper legal warrant. The lead inspector, a tall, stern woman named Agent Harris, ignored his aggressive posturing and brushed right past him. "We do not need an appointment or a warrant for an emergency public health intervention," she stated coldly, flashing her official silver badge directly in his face. "We received 14 separate emergency calls from prominent citizens early this morning. Every single guest who consumed your signature truffle bisque last night was admitted to the local hospital with severe food poisoning and violent gastrointestinal distress. The aggressively boiled dairy combined with raw acidic compounds created a highly dangerous bacterial cocktail that severely compromised their immune systems. We are officially shutting down your kitchen immediately, pending a full federal health investigation." Brad looked like he was going to vomit right there on the polished hardwood floor. He frantically tried to blame the young, inexperienced line cooks, claiming they had maliciously sabotaged the food without his direct knowledge. Agent Harris was not interested in his pathetic excuses or his desperate attempts to shift the blame. She ordered her team of agents to secure the kitchen, quarantine the remaining ingredients, and turned back to Brad. "We are not just here for the contaminated food samples, Mr. Miller," she said, pulling a thick stack of legal paperwork from her heavy briefcase. "The sheer scale of operational negligence reported last night triggered an immediate emergency audit of your corporate licenses. I need to see your daily food safety logs, your temperature control charts, and your original executive health permits right this second." Brad began to physically shake his hands, trembling uncontrollably. He slowly unlocked the filing cabinet behind the bar and handed over the official documents, praying they would just quickly glance at the state stamps and leave him alone. But these were highly trained municipal auditors who knew exactly what to look for. They placed the original health permits flat on the bar and began meticulously cross-referencing them with the new limited liability company paperwork Brad had aggressively filed to steal my equity. The second auditor, a sharp-eyed man with thick-rimmed glasses, tapped his metal pen against the bottom signature line of the original health permit. There is a massive legal discrepancy here, he announced, his voice cutting sharply through Chloe's loud, pathetic sobbing. These initial health permits were officially approved and legally signed by your executive chef, Maya. Her specialized culinary certification is the only legal reason this facility passed its strict Grade A inspection last month. But according to your recently updated corporate filings, Maya was completely removed from the company roster long before these specific permits were ever submitted to the city. The auditor looked up, adjusting his glasses and staring directly into Brad's terrified, sweating face. Maya could not legally sign these official documents if she was no longer a designated partner or employee, which means someone inside this building intentionally forged the signature of a certified executive chef to fraudulently pass a municipal health inspection. That is a clear federal violation, Mr. Miller carrying a mandatory prison sentence. You are completely cornered. The fallout from the health department raid was swift and merciless. Less than 4 hours after the auditors discovered the forged signatures on the executive health permits, my phone rang. It was the senior partner at the expensive corporate law firm Brad hired. They knew Brad was facing severe charges and desperately wanted to contain the massive legal explosion before criminal paperwork was filed. I agreed to the meeting. I walked into the sleek glass-walled conference room wearing my designer suit, carrying a black leather briefcase. The atmosphere inside the room was incredibly suffocating. Brad sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, looking like a completely broken man. His skin was pale and covered in cold, nervous sweat. His expensive custom suit looked crumpled and his hands shook uncontrollably as he gripped a disposable coffee cup. My parents, Marcus and Evelyn, sat directly next to him, looking like they had aged 20 years overnight. Their faces were haggard, their eyes red and swollen from crying and lack of sleep. My sister Chloe was not even there. As soon as I sat down, my mother leaned forward across the heavy wooden table. She did not express any remorse for kicking me out onto the street or allowing Brad to steal my grandmother's house. Instead, she immediately resorted to her classic toxic manipulation tactics. "Maya, please," she begged, her voice cracking with desperate, manufactured emotion. "You have to be the bigger person here. You have to stop this madness right now. Brad is facing mandatory prison time for the permit signatures. The investors are threatening to sue us for gross negligence, and the bank is calling in the mortgage on Big Mama's house. You have the power to fix all of this." I stared at my mother, completely unbothered by her frantic tears. "How exactly do you expect me to fix Brad's forgery charges, Evelyn?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly flat. My father chimed in, his voice shaking with panic. "You just need to sign a backdated employment contract, Maya," he pleaded, rubbing his tired eyes. "If you sign a legal document stating you were officially employed as the executive chef at the exact time the health permits were submitted, the auditors will drop the forgery investigation. It will look like a minor clerical error, and if you hand over your real recipe notebooks today, Brad can prepare a formal apology dinner for the venture capitalists. We can save the restaurant, we can save the house. You just have to give him the real recipes and drop your ridiculous selfish vendetta." I sat back in my plush leather chair, astounded by their unmitigated audacity. They were asking me to commit federal perjury and hand over my intellectual property just to save the man who had maliciously tried to destroy my life. Before I could respond to my father's absurd request, Brad slammed his hand down onto the mahogany table. He was cornered and terrified, but his massive, arrogant ego refused to surrender to reality. He glared at me across the room, his eyes burning with intense hatred. "Do not act like you have the upper hand here, Maya," Brad snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "You intentionally sabotaged my grand opening. You planted that fake notebook specifically to humiliate me and poison my elite guests. That is active corporate sabotage, and I have a dining room full of powerful witnesses who will testify against you. I still legally own the entire concept of the restaurant. I still own the limited liability company. And I still have an active cease and desist order filed against you. If you do not sign the backdated health permits right now, and give me the correct chemical formulas for the tasting menu, I will drag you down to hell with me. I will tie you up in civil court for the next 10 exhausting years. I will make sure you spend every single dime defending yourself against my corporate lawyers. You will never cook in this state again." His senior attorney cringed visibly, closing his tired eyes, as his rogue client actively resorted to criminal blackmail in front of stunned legal professionals. Brad truly thought he was playing hardball. He was completely unaware that he had just brought a plastic knife to a massive legal gunfight. I did not raise my voice. I did not show fear or anger. I looked directly at Brad and let out a soft, genuinely amused laugh. "You are going to drag me down to hell, Brad," I repeated slowly, resting my hands gently on the smooth surface of the expensive table. "You are facing federal fraud charges, massive civil lawsuits from poisoned investors, and total financial bankruptcy. You do not even have the money to pay the men sitting in this room representing you. You do not own anything anymore." "I own your intellectual property," Brad screamed, leaning wildly over the table, his face turning purple. "I filed the legal paperwork. It belongs exclusively to the family restaurant." I calmly reached down and unlatched the dual silver clasps of my black leather briefcase. It opened with a sharp, satisfying metallic click that echoed loudly in the tense, silent room. Brad and my parents watched my hands closely, fully expecting me to finally pull out my actual handwritten recipe notebooks to surrender my culinary secrets and save their miserable lives. But I did not reach for a notebook. Instead, I pulled out a heavy stack of thick, officially watermarked federal documents, securely bound together inside a thick blue legal folder. I placed the heavy stack of documents directly in the center of the mahogany table and slid them firmly directly toward Brad's senior attorney. I did not break eye contact with my arrogant brother-in-law. "Let us talk about intellectual property, Brad," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, razor-sharp whisper. "And let us talk about exactly who is going to federal prison today." I slid the heavy blue legal folder directly across the polished mahogany surface. It glided smoothly and stopped right in front of the senior attorney. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, looking slightly annoyed by my confident display, and flipped open the thick cover. I sat in total silence and watched his eyes scan the first page. Then I watched them widen in absolute horror. He quickly flipped to the second page and then the third, his breathing becoming shallow and noticeably rapid. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like he had just seen a terrifying ghost. He swallowed hard, his professional composure completely disintegrating right in front of my eyes. Brad leaned over the heavy wooden table, trying to see what was written on the papers, but the attorney immediately slammed his hand down over the documents. "Do not say another word, Brad." The attorney hissed, his voice tight with sudden intense panic. "Do not open your mouth. Do not make another statement in this room." "What is it?" Brad demanded, his voice cracking with rising fear. "What did she give you? Tell me what those papers say." The attorney looked up at me with a mixture of genuine fear and begrudging professional respect. "These are official certificates of registration from the United States Patent and Trademark Office," the attorney explained, turning to look at his ruined client. His voice was trembling slightly. "They are federally approved trademarks for the Midnight Supper Club restaurant concept, along with comprehensive utility patents for over 40 specific chemical flavor profiles, spice blends, and cooking techniques. That specifically includes the Cajun truffle bisque you served last night." Brad scoffed loudly, waving his hand dismissively in the air. "That is completely impossible. She fabricated them. She does not own the restaurant, and she does not have the authority to trademark family property." "She does not need to own the restaurant," Brad, the attorney snapped, losing his patience completely and glaring at the arrogant man sitting next to him. "She filed these federal applications exactly 3 years ago. They were fully approved and legally registered long before you even married her sister. They were finalized long before you created your new limited liability company and stole her equity. She is the sole legal proprietor of every single recipe you served to those wealthy investors last night. You stole federally protected property." The room went completely silent. The heavy, terrifying realization of what I had successfully executed settled over them like a thick, suffocating blanket. I had not just anticipated Brad's greedy betrayal, I had legally bulletproofed my entire professional existence years in advance. I knew exactly who these toxic people were, and I knew they would eventually try to steal my life work. I had simply let them dig their own massive grave. You cannot issue a cease and desist order on intellectual property that I federally own. Brad, I said, leaning back in my comfortable leather chair and crossing my arms. You cannot legally claim my culinary creations as your proprietary trade secrets, but I certainly can. I reached back into my black leather briefcase and pulled out one single sheet of crisp white paper. I slid it across the mahogany table toward Brad. It was a formal legal notice drafted by Davis and Mr. Sterling's elite corporate legal team early this morning. And I am officially suing you for $5 million for blatant trademark infringement, malicious defamation, and extreme financial damages. I announced, my voice ringing with total absolute authority. You intentionally sold my federally protected property for commercial gain. You launched a massive public smear campaign to destroy my professional reputation. And you maliciously interfered with my ability to secure employment by threatening independent business owners. My legal team has already secured the digital invitations you sent out yesterday, and we have sworn audio recordings of your arrogant presentation last night. We have you dead to rights. Brad stared at the single sheet of paper as if it were a loaded gun pointed directly at his chest. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but no sound came out. The arrogant finance bro who genuinely thought he could easily crush the sweaty urban cook was entirely paralyzed by his own monumental stupidity. He was looking at total financial ruin and a very likely prison sentence. My father, Marcus, suddenly stood up, his chair violently scraping against the hardwood floor. His face was twisted in a mixture of extreme confusion and explosive, desperate anger. "This is completely ridiculous," my father shouted, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "Federal patents and high-powered corporate lawyers cost tens of thousands of dollars, Maya. You have been working in hot kitchens your entire life. You are just a line cook who barely makes enough money to pay rent at a cheap apartment. How in the world did you afford to secretly hire federal patent attorneys 3 years ago?" My mother, Evelyn, nodded frantically, latching onto his desperate denial. "She is bluffing, Marcus," she cried out, her voice shrill. "She probably printed those fake documents off the internet to scare us. Where would she get that kind of money? She is completely broke." I looked at my parents, feeling a deep wave of incredibly satisfying closure wash over me. This was the exact moment I had waited years for. The moment I finally shattered their precious delusions about who was truly valued in this family. "I did not print them off the internet, Evelyn," I replied coldly. "And I paid my expensive federal attorneys with cash. Cash that was given directly to me by Grandpa Theodore." My mother gasped loudly, her hand flying up to cover her mouth in pure shock. My father froze completely, his eyes bulging out of his head. "What are you talking about?" Marcus demanded, his voice dropping to an unstable, raspy whisper. "Grandpa Theodore left his entire estate to the family trust. He left Big Mama's house to us. He did not leave you any cash. He loved Chloe. Chloe was always his favorite granddaughter. He would never give you money behind our backs." I smiled a sad, knowing smile. "That is exactly what he let you believe, because he knew exactly how greedy and toxic you all were. Grandpa Theodore saw right through your shallow obsession with country club status. He knew you constantly favored Chloe because she was willing to play the role of the perfect, compliant daughter. But he respected hard work. He respected the fact that I spent every single summer working in his hot garden and helping him fix up his dirty rental properties while Chloe was busy buying expensive clothes." I stood up from my chair and looked down at my stunned, defeated family. When Grandpa Theodore died, he quietly left a secret secondary account entirely in my name. It contained exactly $200,000. He left strict, legally binding instructions with his estate lawyer that no one in the family was ever to know about it. He told me to use it to protect myself from the exact people sitting in this room today. He knew you would try to use me and throw me away, so he gave me the armor to fight back. I used his money to hire the best intellectual property lawyers in the state to secure my recipes 3 years ago. I knew this day would eventually come. I was simply waiting for Brad to be arrogant enough to spring the trap. The revelation of Grandpa Theodore's secret account hung in the air like a physical blow. My mother stared at me, her mouth opening and closing silently. My father sank back into his chair, a look of utter defeat washing over his aged features. They had underestimated me for my entire life, but the absolute betrayal they felt at discovering my grandfather had secretly funded my independence was clearly tearing them apart. But I was not finished. The patent documents were only the first half of my legal assault. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I unlocked the screen and opened an audio application. Before Brad or his panicking attorney could say another word, I placed the phone gently in the center of the mahogany table and pressed play. The audio was incredibly clear, recorded on the high-quality microphone of my phone the night of the massive grand opening disaster. My own voice echoed in the quiet conference room, asking Brad a direct question about suing me for corporate sabotage. Then Brad's voice filled the room, dripping with that familiar, disgusting arrogance. Yes, Maya, I did restructure the operating agreement. I had my legal team draft new documents, and I convinced your father to sign off on them behind your back. We completely removed your name from the limited liability company. We completely erased your 40% equity stake. I paused the recording right there. In this specific state, only one party needs to consent to an audio recording for it to be legally admissible in a court of law, I explained smoothly. I consented, which means I just handed my attorneys a pristine audio confession of you admitting to fraudulent restructuring. You stole my equity, and you did it maliciously. Brad's senior attorney did not hesitate. He did not offer a defense. He did not try to negotiate a settlement. He stood up so fast his heavy leather chair skidded backward across the polished hardwood floor. He reached out with trembling hands and rapidly began shoving his legal pads and expensive pens into his briefcase. "What are you doing?" Brad shrieked, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated terror. "You are my lawyer. You have to fix this. You have to defend me." The senior attorney snapped his briefcase shut with a loud, sharp click. "I am legally bound by the ethical codes of my profession, Mr. Miller," the lawyer stated, his voice colder than ice. "I cannot and will not represent a client who actively confesses to federal fraud and malicious corporate theft on tape. My firm is officially withdrawing from your case effective immediately. I highly suggest you find a very good criminal defense attorney by the end of the day. You are going to need one." Without another word, the attorney turned on his heel and marched out of the conference room, the heavy glass door swinging shut behind him. Brad was left sitting at the massive mahogany table, completely abandoned and legally defenseless. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of my mother Evelyn beginning to cry. She finally understood. The pristine image of the wealthy, successful white son-in-law had completely shattered, exposing the desperate, incompetent con artist underneath. She had allowed this man to mortgage her mother's house and steal her daughter's business simply because he wore expensive suits and spoke with unearned authority. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing loudly into the quiet room. Suddenly, the conference room door burst open again. Chloe ran into the room, her face red and blotchy, her hair disheveled. She had clearly been crying non-stop since the disastrous tasting night. She ignored me completely and ran straight toward her husband. "Brad," she wailed, grabbing his shoulders. "I just got a call from the country club. They are revoking our membership. Everyone is talking about the food poisoning. The venture capitalists are threatening to destroy us. What are we going to do?" Brad looked up at his wife, his eyes completely vacant. He had nothing left to say. He had no more lies to spin and no more arrogant threats to make. The crushing weight of the $5 million lawsuit, the federal forgery charges, and the complete loss of his public reputation had finally broken him. I slowly stood up from my comfortable leather chair. I gathered the federal patent documents and slipped them carefully back into my black briefcase. I fastened the silver clasps and picked it up by the handle. The war was officially over, and I had won the absolute total victory. I looked at the pathetic broken family sitting around the table and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no lingering desire for their toxic approval. I was completely free. I turned and walked toward the heavy glass door of the conference room. But just before I pushed it open, I stopped and looked back over my shoulder. My eyes locked directly onto Brad's terrified face. "By the way, Brad," I said, my voice soft but carrying clearly across the room, "you should probably check your email right now. The regional bank called my lawyers about an hour ago regarding the second commercial mortgage you illegally took out on Big Mama's house." Brad flinched violently, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He reached into his pocket with trembling hands and pulled out his cell phone. Chloe stopped crying and stared at him, her eyes wide with mounting terror. My parents froze completely, holding their breath as they waited for the final devastating blow to fall. Brad stared down at the glowing screen of his cell phone. His hands were shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the device onto the floor. I watched his eyes dart back and forth across the text of the email. With every single word he read, his face seemed to cave in on itself. He let out a low, agonizing groan that sounded like a wounded animal and let the phone slip from his fingers. It clattered loudly against the polished mahogany table and slid directly over to my father. Marcus did not hesitate. He lunged forward and grabbed the phone, his eyes squinting as he read the screen. "What does this mean?" my father demanded, his voice rising in panic. "What is a default acceleration clause, Brad?" Brad did not answer. He just sat there staring blankly at the wall, completely paralyzed by his impending ruin. Marcus read the email out loud, his voice trembling so hard he could barely form the words. The regional bank was formally notifying Brad's holding company that the second commercial mortgage on the residential property, known as Big Mama's house, was immediately in default. Because the family restaurant had been officially shut down by the state health department earlier that morning, the bank had exercised their right to conduct an emergency review of the loan terms. They discovered that Brad had used entirely fraudulent revenue projections to secure the massive loan. Since the primary source of projected income was now permanently padlocked and facing a massive federal health investigation, the bank was triggering the acceleration clause. The entire balance of the loan was due immediately. If the massive sum was not paid in full within 7 days, the bank would officially begin foreclosure proceedings. Evelyn let out a blood-curdling scream. She grabbed the edge of the heavy wooden table, her knuckles turning completely white. "They are taking the house!" she shrieked, looking wildly between my father and Brad. "They are taking my mother's house. Where are we supposed to go, Marcus? We do not have that kind of cash. We are going to be homeless." My father's face transitioned from pale terror to absolute explosive rage. The realization that he had handed over his childhood home to an arrogant con artist finally broke his mind. He let out a deafening roar and physically lunged across the mahogany table. Marcus grabbed Brad by the lapels of his expensive crumpled suit and violently yanked him out of his chair. "You worthless, lying piece of garbage," my father screamed, slamming Brad aggressively against the glass wall of the conference room. "You promised me this was a foolproof investment. You told me you knew exactly how to handle the finances. You stole my mother's house and you destroyed my family. I am going to kill you." Brad weakly put his hands up, trying to defend himself, but he was completely broken. He just whimpered as my father shook him violently against the glass. Chloe, who had been standing frozen near the door, suddenly snapped into action. She saw the total destruction of her luxurious lifestyle and her perfectly curated image. She realized that staying married to Brad meant tying herself to massive debt, federal fraud charges, and extreme social humiliation. She stepped forward and pointed an accusing finger right at her husband's face. "Get your hands off him, Dad," Chloe yelled, but not out of concern for Brad. She glared at her husband with pure, unadulterated disgust. "I am done with you, Brad. Do you hear me? I am calling my lawyers right this second and filing for an immediate divorce. I had absolutely no idea you were committing bank fraud. I am not going down for your criminal mistakes. I want you completely out of my life." Brad slid down the glass wall as my father finally let go of his suit. He sat on the floor of the conference room, a pathetic, weeping mess, as his wife abandoned him on the spot. Then the entire family suddenly remembered I was still standing by the door, holding my heavy black briefcase. The dynamic in the room shifted instantly. The violent anger morphed into frantic, desperate begging. My father rushed over to me, dropping to his knees on the hardwood floor right in front of me. Evelyn ran over and grabbed my arm, her tears staining her expensive makeup. "Maya, you have to save us," my mother sobbed, clinging to my jacket. "You have Mr. Sterling's $7 million. You have Grandpa Theodore's secret money. You are rich, Maya. You can just call the bank right now and pay off the mortgage in cash. You can buy Big Mama's house back today." My father looked up at me, his hands clasped together in desperate prayer. "Please, Maya," he begged, his voice cracking. "It is our family home, Emily. It is where you grew up. You cannot just let a bank auction it off to strangers. You have the power to fix all of this. Please be the bigger person and save your family." I looked down at the two people who had given me life. I looked at my sister, who was standing a few feet away, nodding frantically along with their desperate pleas. I thought about the decades of emotional abuse, the constant belittling and the blatant favoritism. I thought about how quickly they had kicked me out of my apartment and watched Brad steal my equity. They only cared about my talent and my money when it could be used to clean up the massive toxic messes they created. I gently but firmly pulled my arm out of my mother's desperate grip. I took a step back, putting physical distance between myself and their toxicity. "You watched him steal my legacy," I said, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy or warmth. "You helped him pack my bags and throw me out onto the street. You gladly handed him the keys to Big Mama's house because you thought his whiteness and his fake business degree made him superior to my hard work. You made your choice. But we are your family," Evelyn cried out, reaching for me again. "No, you are not," I replied coldly. "You are just people I used to know. Big Mama's house is gone. And so am I." I turned my back on them, pushed open the heavy glass door, and walked out of the conference room. I did not look back as their desperate screams and frantic sobbing echoed down the quiet hallway behind me. I walked straight to the elevator, pressed the button for the ground floor, and rode it down in complete, peaceful silence. I rode the elevator down to the ground floor in complete, peaceful silence. I walked out into the bright afternoon sun, feeling lighter than I had in 33 years. The next 7 days were a rapid, brutal whirlwind of legal and financial consequences for my former family. The state health department officially revoked every single operating license attached to Brad's holding company. The local district attorney formally indicted Brad on 3 separate counts of federal commercial fraud and felony forgery. His passport was immediately confiscated, and he was released on a massive cash bail that completely drained whatever hidden emergency funds he had managed to squirrel away. Chloe made good on her frantic threat in the conference room. She officially filed for an emergency divorce and moved out of their luxury townhouse right before the federal bank could seize it. But because Chloe had never worked a day in her life, she had absolutely no money of her own to fall back on. She was forced to move into a tiny, cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the worst side of town, along with my parents, who had officially lost Big Mama's house to the regional bank. They were all completely destitute, living on top of each other, and drowning in a toxic swamp of mutual resentment and bitter daily arguments. Exactly 1 week after the disastrous tasting night, the regional bank held a closed commercial foreclosure auction inside the municipal courthouse. The primary property on the auction block was the family restaurant. The bank wanted to aggressively liquidate the physical asset to recoup the massive fraudulent loan Brad had taken out. I knew exactly when and where the auction was taking place, because Mr. Sterling and his elite legal team had been monitoring the bank's foreclosure schedule like absolute hawks. We had a very specific strategic plan, and the timing had to be absolutely flawless. I arrived at the municipal building early that morning, but I did not go inside the auction room immediately. I stood out in the cold marble hallway, completely hidden behind a large stone architectural pillar, watching the attendees file through the heavy oak doors. Brad walked in looking like a hollow, rotting shell of a human being. He was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit because his entire designer wardrobe had been seized during his personal bankruptcy filing. He was sweating profusely and frantically whispering to two older wealthy men he used to play golf with at the exclusive country club. He was desperately begging them for a private off-the-books loan. He was trying to scrape together just enough pennies from his former friends to place a minimum opening bid on the restaurant building. He genuinely believed that if he could just win the physical building back at a massive discount, he could somehow relaunch the business under a fake name and afford to dig his way out of federal prison. His former country club friends looked deeply uncomfortable. They physically leaned away from him, clearly repulsed by his desperation and his highly publicized criminal status. They shook their heads firmly, refusing to give him a single dime. Brad was completely on his own, isolated and publicly disgraced. My father Marcus walked into the auction room a few minutes later. He looked physically exhausted and totally defeated, wearing the exact same wrinkled shirt he had been wearing for 2 days. He sat in the very back row, far away from Brad, staring blankly at the floor. He was only there to witness the final official death of his stolen legacy. The bank auctioneer, a stern man with a thick gray mustache, stepped up to the wooden podium at the front of the room. He read the long legal foreclosure notice aloud, officially opening the bidding process for the fully furnished commercial restaurant property. He set the opening minimum bid at a fraction of what those imported crystal chandeliers and crushed velvet booths were actually worth. Brad immediately shot his trembling hand into the air, his voice cracking as he shouted out a pathetic lowball number. He looked around the room, a desperate, frantic glimmer of false hope flashing in his bloodshot eyes. He thought nobody else would want a disgraced building tied to a massive food poisoning scandal and a revoked health permit. He thought he was going to get incredibly lucky and steal my kitchen all over again. But before the auctioneer could even acknowledge Brad's weak opening offer, a tall, sharply dressed man, sitting in the very front row, calmly raised a numbered white paddle high into the air. This man was Davis, the lead corporate attorney representing Mr. Sterling and my new company. Davis did not just raise the bid by a few $1,000s. He spoke clearly and loudly, dropping a massive preemptive all-cash bid that echoed like a physical bomb detonating inside the quiet auction room. The massive number he called out was high enough to instantly satisfy the bank's aggressive liquidation quota, but still low enough to be an absolute financial steal for a fully renovated commercial property. Brad gasped loudly, stumbling backward and gripping the back of a wooden chair to keep from collapsing onto the floor. That cash offer was all the money he had left in the entire world, multiplied by 10. He could not even comprehend the sheer volume of wealth Davis had just casually thrown into the air. The auctioneer looked around the room, but nobody else even bothered to raise their paddles. The cash offer was absolute and unbeatable. Going once, the auctioneer called out, striking his heavy wooden gavel against the podium. Going twice. Sold to the proxy buyer in the front row. Brad let out a devastated, agonizing cry. He rushed forward, aggressively pointing his shaking finger at Davis. "Who are you representing?" Brad screamed, his voice echoing wildly off the marble walls. "Who gave you that kind of cash? You cannot take my restaurant. That is my proprietary concept." I stepped out from behind the stone pillar in the hallway and walked slowly toward the heavy oak doors. Mr. Sterling had arrived a few minutes earlier and was standing right beside me, looking incredibly sharp in a dark navy suit. He gave me a brief, respectful nod. "It is time," he said quietly. I pushed the heavy oak doors open and walked directly into the center of the auction room, with the billionaire venture capitalist walking right beside me. The loud, aggressive sound of Brad's screaming instantly died in his throat. My father Marcus jerked his head up from the back row, his eyes widening in pure, absolute shock. I walked right past the rows of wooden chairs and stopped directly in front of my ruined brother-in-law. I was wearing a stunning tailored designer suit, holding my heavy black leather briefcase. "He is representing me, Brad," I said, my voice completely calm and echoing clearly in the silent room. "I am the proxy buyer." Brad stared at me, his jaw practically unhinged. "You," he whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief. "You do not have that kind of money." Mr. Sterling stepped forward, resting his hand casually inside his suit pocket. "She does now," Sterling announced, his deep, authoritative voice commanding absolute respect from everyone in the room. "Maya is the majority owner and executive chef of a newly funded hospitality group, and she just legally purchased this entire building out from under you for pennies on the dollar." I looked around the room, taking in the absolute total victory. I looked at my father, who was quietly weeping in the back row, unable to even meet my gaze. Then I looked back at Brad, who was staring at his own completely unavoidable destruction. "I did not just win the intellectual property lawsuit, Brad," I stated coldly. "I just bought the imported crystal chandeliers. I bought the custom velvet booths. I bought the massive professional-grade kitchen you tried to lock me out of. This building no longer belongs to your fraudulent holding company. It officially belongs to Maya's Table Limited Liability Company. Now get out of my restaurant." Two heavily armed court security guards immediately stepped forward, grabbing Brad's arms and physically dragging him out of the municipal auction room. He kicked and screamed the entire way down the cold marble hallway, echoing like a petulant child, but nobody lifted a single finger to help him. My father simply lowered his tired head and walked out the side door, disappearing into the busy city streets without saying a single word to me. The heavy, suffocating dark cloud that had been hanging over my entire existence was finally lifted. The war was over, and I had the keys to my own kingdom. Exactly 4 months later, the line to get into the official grand opening of Maya's Table wrapped completely around the entire city block. People had been camping out since 3 o'clock in the afternoon just to get a seat at the bar. I did not keep the sterile fake country club aesthetic that Brad had completely bankrupted my family to build. I tore down the pretentious velvet booths and replaced them with warm, natural wood, vibrant local art, and a massive open-concept kitchen. The restaurant was alive, pulsating with loud, energetic music and the rich, complex aromas of my proprietary Cajun truffle fusion menu. I was not hiding in the back of the kitchen anymore. I was the executive chef and the majority owner, and I made sure every single person in the building knew exactly who was running the show. I walked out into the packed dining room wearing a pristine white, double-breasted chef coat. My natural dreadlocks were pulled back but fully visible, flowing freely down my back. The sleeves of my coat were rolled up proudly, displaying the intricate culinary tattoos covering my arms. I did not tone myself down to make wealthy people feel comfortable. I demanded respect through my absolute, undeniable brilliance. Mr. Sterling was sitting at the best corner table in the house, raising a glass of expensive bourbon to me as I walked past. Sitting right next to him was the notorious local food critic who had publicly destroyed Brad 4 months ago. Tonight, she was literally scraping the bottom of her porcelain bowl with her silver spoon, desperately trying to get every last drop of my authentic signature bisque. She looked up at me and gave me a massive, genuine smile, telling me it was the greatest culinary experience of her entire professional career. While I was standing in the bright, warm glow of my massive success, the people who had maliciously tried to bury me were actively drowning in the consequences of their own toxic greed. Brad managed to avoid a long federal prison sentence by taking a highly restrictive plea deal, but he lost absolutely everything in the process. He was legally barred from ever working in the financial sector again. Right at this exact moment, he was wearing a bright neon orange safety vest, sweating under the brutal afternoon sun, as he picked up dirty trash along the side of the local highway to fulfill his 1,000 hours of court-ordered community service. Every time a car drove past and splashed him with dirty puddle water, he was reminded of the massive empire he threw away because of his own blinding arrogance. Chloe was faring no better. Without Brad's stolen money to fund her designer lifestyle, she was forced to enter the real world. The former golden child, who used to look down on me for working with my hands, was now standing behind a cheap plastic register at a discount retail store, folding sweaters for minimum wage. She spent 8 hours a day getting yelled at by angry, rude customers, and she had to take the public bus back to the cramped apartment she now shared with our disgraced parents. Marcus and Evelyn were completely isolated from the community they had spent their entire lives trying to impress. The local church congregation completely shunned them after the massive public fraud scandal. The country club elites pretended they did not even exist. They spent their days sitting in absolute silence in their tiny apartment, mourning the loss of Big Mama's house, and realizing that they had backed the completely wrong horse. I walked over to the front hostess stand to check the reservation book for the evening. The restaurant was completely booked solid for the next 6 months. As I was looking over the names, my personal cell phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was a text message from my mother, Evelyn. The message was a long, pathetic paragraph. She told me how incredibly proud she was of my grand opening. She claimed she always knew I was a genius, and that she had always supported my culinary dreams. Then she casually asked if I could somehow squeeze her and my father in for a VIP table tonight, because they really wanted to celebrate as a family. I stared at the text message, reading the desperate, manipulative words. I did not feel angry. I did not feel sad. I felt absolutely nothing for the woman who had happily helped pack my bags when I was evicted. I tapped the screen, deleted the long text message without replying, and permanently blocked her phone number from my device. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, taking a deep breath of the incredible food roasting in my kitchen. I turned around and faced the bright lights, the cheering customers, and the beautiful empire I had built with my own 2 hands. They tried to bury me in the kitchen because they thought I was just the help. But they forgot I was the one who controlled the fire. Have you ever had to watch the people who betrayed you lose everything? Tell me your stories in the comments. Do not forget to like and subscribe to keep building your own empire. The most profound lesson we can draw from Maya's harrowing yet triumphant journey is that your true worth is never defined by those who are committed to underestimating you. For her entire life, Maya's family relegated her to the background, viewing her immense talent merely as a tool to fund their own superficial ambitions. They confused her quiet dedication for weakness and her willingness to work hard for a lack of intelligence. However, Maya teaches us that the greatest defense against toxic environments is not to scream for validation, but to quietly and strategically secure your own foundation. When we find ourselves trapped in spaces where our contributions are exploited, but our humanity is ignored, the natural instinct is often to fight for recognition. We desperately want the people who hurt us to finally see our value. But Maya's story shifts this paradigm. She did not beg for her family's approval or try to convince arrogant people of her worth. Instead, she took actionable, legally binding steps to protect her intellectual property and her future. She built an impenetrable fortress around her talent. The tragedy of her family is that their arrogant assumption of superiority became the exact mechanism of their downfall. They thought they were manipulating a powerless scapegoat, entirely unaware they were dealing with a mastermind who had already outgrown their small world. Ultimately, this story reminds us that we are the sole architects of our own legacy. You cannot control how toxic people perceive you, but you possess absolute control over how you protect your boundaries and your gifts. Sometimes the most powerful move is to walk away in silence and let your success be the final word. Take a moment today to evaluate where you are giving away your power and commit to fiercely protecting your own worth.